you watched Monty Python, and that was a big part of your childhood. But you became quite close and friendly with John Cleese. I know you're probably sick of the conversation about you meeting with Scott Morrison and the side-eye view of Scott Morrison.
Maybe I could be your sidekick.
Yeah,
you
if
could. Looks could kill.
Yeah.
Maybe we could. I reckon we could take out
whole
regimes.
Grace Tame, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Thanks for having me.
I know you're a busy person, so I feel very privileged to get you here in the studio and to have a chat.
I feel privileged to be here. I listen to your podcast. It's one of my favourites.
Oh, that's good. We can talk about that if you like. Well, that's great.
We'll just do a 40-minute promo for I Catch Killers.
And there you have it. Grace Tame, favourite podcast, I Catch Killers. I've just finished your memoir, The Ninth Life of a Diamond Miner. I'm reading that out because it is a strange title. We'll talk about that. I got to say I really enjoyed it. I was reading it when I was trekking through Asia on holidays, and so at the end of each day that was my go-to thing, the thing that I had to look forward to, and I've got to say I enjoyed the book. How did you feel writing the book?
I can't pinpoint one particular feeling. I mean, there were it's really odd to reflect on. We were talking before the podcast about what it was like at 27 to write a book.
Yes.
That is a memoir, which is sort of supposed to be about one's life, which for me, it's sort of only just beginning, or it's in the beginning phase. Even though up to this point there have been many pretty intense events. My life's been pretty pendulous, inconsistent, unstable in many ways. There's been a good balance, though, of light and dark, which is what we need.
Most definitely. I think it's interesting that you say that, because that's what came out in the book when I was reading it. I'm laughing, I'm crying. It took you through the emotions, but that's life, isn't it?
Yeah, that's life, and that's what it was like for me, though, when I was writing it. I found myself at times crying, but then also laughing. Humour is something that's really helped me to process a lot of the trauma that I'm still processing, a lot of the things that I went through, especially as a child. Only time and age can actually contextualise. You need to have distance to reframe things. And for a long time, I was moving at such a pace and sort of existing in survival mode. So when I actually stopped and allowed all of these experiences to sort of sink in, to absorb, and then as well dug even deeper into some dormant layers of trauma that I hadn't allowed myself to reflect on. All of these other things came to the surface, and I'm often asked when I talk about the book if it was cathartic. And in some ways it was. In other ways, I'd be lying if I said that it was easy, and that I realised, and I actually wrote in the book, I realised why some people choose not to talk about their trauma, and that is in many ways also a brave thing to do. What's really important for anyone who's been through any kind of trauma, and especially child sexual abuse, which is in a class all of its own, it's an unequivocal crime against nature. It has to be on your terms, whether you want to not talk about it, or whether you want to share it in whatever capacity. It has to be returned. The power has to be returned to you, because anything that happens to you as a child against your will happens to you before you've ever had a chance,
had any control,
any autonomy, and then there is abuse that happens, of course, in adulthood, but that's very different to if you've never ever had control and been able to set the terms. And because of that, after I was abused when I was quite young as well. I talk about that in the book, and I didn't delve into that too much. That's quite sensitive, and even when I talked about the offending, I didn't detail it as much as I probably could have. There are still a lot of things that I am unpacking there, and the experiences that I had after those things as well, because my frame of reference was that, and especially for, of want of a better word, intimacy, or for relationships, again, of want of a better word, but for interacting with people, what becomes your familiar in childhood sets the stage for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Children who've been sexually abused have a 500% chance of being re-victimised later in life. And, I came to sort of just, while sort of writing the book and exploring all of those things, really be quite confronted by a lot of my own life experiences. So there was catharsis, but there was also almost like a fresh trauma.
I can imagine that would be the case. When you're putting it down in words, it's basically staring you back at the face. You can't just sort of brush it away or just a fleeting thought. You're there, you're reading it, it's hitting you.
And interestingly, in the psychology of trauma and processing it, it's harder for people to absorb their own story than it is to expiate it. So if you speak about your trauma, that's one thing. But even to read and almost reabsorb it, even if they're your own words. So I often find if I've done an interview that's recorded, I can't stand to watch it. It's almost like I'm hearing it for the first time, even though it's my own experience that I went through, and I'm feeling empathy for that child, and I'm quite disturbed by that. Last night I was having dinner with 3 fellow child sexual abuse survivors who are doing incredible public work to draw attention to different issues. David Meager, whose book has just come out, Secrets and Lies, and then Matt Barker, who is taking on Scouts New South Wales, and then Harry James, who, along with Jared Grice, who's also a survivor of child sexual abuse, is campaigning here in New South Wales to stop character references being relevant to sentencing in cases of child sexual abuse. And we were all talking about this particular issue, and Matt pointed out that he has also, in a way, desensitized himself to his own experience to be able to speak about it. But whenever he reads somebody else's story, that's when he connects with the emotion, and that's when he taps into that self that was a child. And even then, that just hit me last night, and I went, yeah, that's exactly what happens to me as well, is when I read something else and I go back there.
It's a hard situation for yourself and the three people that you mentioned, that it's a platform to talk about it, but it's almost taking you back into it every time you've got to get on the platform and push for changes that you're looking for. Yeah,
it is. It's many things, and I often say that. I say many things can be true at once and many opposing things can be true at once. Yeah. Is that it's really important to be able to spotlight that lived experience, which is what taps into people's hearts to inform that change. But, like anything, especially like child sexual abuse, which is a sort of a broad spectrum within that, scope of crime, that scope of offending, to have that lived experience, but marry it with other expertise. So to recognise, like you've said, it is something that it's important to get it out there. And the reason why I say it's important to get it out there is because if we have this sort of mass disclosure, the hope is that we can not take this lightly and we can hear this stuff and we can use it now, tap into this now and create better prevention methods and not always be focused on this reactive responding and accepting this as just a fact of life that happens.
I think you've made a very important point there that we should be proactive.
Proactive, yeah, because there's a lot of responses. There's a lot of inquiries, and we do need that, of course, because there's a lot of historic stuff that because of the shame and silence that we had for such a long time, which were more common than what we've got now. What we've got now is people realizing that that the physical stuff is one thing. You can't take away that pain that is very real. But part of the psychological mechanism that these offenders who often network, part of that psychological mechanism relies on the rest of the community, not just the victims, actually believing that you have to participate in that. You have to participate in that culture of silence and suppression. And when you start to believe and realise that at least a big part of that is very much like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain and them just like operating these little levers behind there and puffing themselves up to be much bigger and stronger than what they are. You go, I don't have to play this game anymore. And we can also do that too. And we can work together and network. And what we can do is create better child protection measures that are, like you said, proactive instead of just reacting to what's already happened.
Well, it's one thing reacting, but I think we've all got to take ownership in it. And this has been my thing on child sexual abuse, is that so often there's warning signs there. There's red flags. And we had a brief chat before we started this, and I talk about how when someone's identified as being a child sex offender, invariably people put their hands up and go, oh yeah, I thought there was something strange about that person. Time and time again. We've got to act on those feelings when there is something strange. But I just want to focus on a couple of things. First of all, your public perception. And I'll put my hand up here. I'm guilty of it. I see you in the media and all that, and I see that you're very intense, you're committed, and you're driven to make things right. But there's so much...
You read the Murdoch press, do you, Gary? The pointy finger, the frowny face.
I look at all media, but I'm open-minded, and I've read your book, and I realise there's so much more to Grace Tame than what the public. And I think the media are responsible for that. The easy caption for Grace is you looking stern and pointing the finger and you're angry, and that's an easy headline. But there is so much more, and I want to get that out in the podcast a little bit. And you talked about comedy. One of the things that I think in all the light and darkness, you need to, and I was a homicide detective for 25 years, saw a lot of dark stuff, but you had to laugh. Call it black humour or whatever, because you can't cope that long unless you have the ability to not only laugh at yourself, but just the circumstances. And that's not being disrespectful to the environment or what's happened. But if you don't, it'll wear you down. One of the things you've a quote from the book, comedy is a wonderful source of healing and connection, and it's a personal passion. Do you want to just explain that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I grew up being fed on a diet of Monty Python and Fawlty Towers and all kinds of...
Did you think they were documentaries?
Pretty much. No, I was really grateful to both my parents have really healthy senses of humour, dry senses of humour, and really, really open minds. And that's been really helpful to me. I think humour is a really powerful tool, like you said, to access that light. And laughter is the ultimate reflex of happiness. It's the apex of happiness because you can't suppress it. So even if you're sad and somebody makes you laugh, and sometimes you
I want to be cranky.
I want to be, but you can't help it. And I love that. I think there's something so beautiful about it because it's so pure, and it's also, it transcends every barrier. It transcends languages, and it also transcends age groups too, and the complete silliness cut with intellect, everything. It's this beautiful connective tissue that can unite people, and I really love that. And it can push boundaries in ways, like Robin Williams was one of my, comedy heroes, if you will. While I think that also putting people on pedestals isn't necessarily healthy, I think recognizing that we're all human. But he was somebody who was very human and was very open about his struggles and things like that, which is something that I also connected to and saw was really important. Especially being in the public eye, and going through trauma and realizing that, to be able to laugh at oneself, I think I use humor in a way not to make light of the awful things that are happening, but to use it as a way to, I guess, punch up instead of punching down.
I get it, and people are often surprised. They'll see me speaking to families of victims of homicide, and we've had some great laughs.
Yeah.
And I come into their life at the worst possible time. A loved one's been murdered, but it helps a coping mechanism to be able to laugh at situations, and so I do see the benefit there. I just want to touch on this. I was going to bring it up later, but I found it interesting because I just didn't make the connection. You watch Monty Python, and that was a big part of your childhood, but you became quite close and friendly with John Cleese.
Yeah, so I'm really good friends with his...
Explain that one.
Yeah, I'm really good friends with his daughter. So his daughter is a brilliant comedian in her own right, and I would argue the funniest Cleese that there is, not John.
Okay, so he's the second funniest in the family.
Yeah, he is. Yeah. He's the second funniest. Camilla and I are really good friends. John's actually here at the moment in Australia, and Camilla was just down in Tasmania, staying with us.
Right.
I've known her since I was 19 years old. I was studying at just a community college in Santa Barbara. I moved to the United States when I was 18. After everything that happened, I just sort of wanted anonymity,
Yeah, I understand.
So I moved over to Santa Barbara, and Camilla was just doing a stand-up comedy gig at the back of an Italian restaurant called Petrini's, and my friend Josue, who I met in college, who also liked doing comedy, he's actually a comedian himself now, which is really great because I can't speak for him and I can't share his story, but he's also overcome a lot of adversity, and we connected through comedy, and we went to this gig, we met Camilla, and Camilla and I connected, and we just got along. We just started chatting, and she said, let's connect on social media, and a friendship spawned from there. And she saw that I drew, because I have always drawn as a hobby, and while I was in college it was something that I did on the side, and she asked me eventually, a few years later, to draw something for John for a Father's Day present that blossomed from what was originally just this seed of an idea to do. Sounds so silly. So John has these Maine Coon cats. So if for those of you who don't know, a Maine Coon is like a hybrid of a small cat and almost like a big cat. It's like 5 kilos. It's like as big as me, basically. It's just a cat. He's got like 5 of them, I think, or he did at the time. He's got at least 4 of them, and he loves them. He's taken them on television with him before. Yeah. He's that obsessed with his cats, and the idea was to do a portrait that was like a send up, an homage to like a piece of high art, like the Mona Lisa or something. And eventually we decided that I could do The Last Supper and put the cats in as disciples, because he liked it so much. When we showed it to him, he sort of broke into hilarious laughter. He's got this sort of wheezing, hilarious laughter, which in of itself is contagious. And that's another thing about laughter. Even if you're not laughing yourself and somebody else, he's got this this sort of very hearty laugh. He liked it so much that he asked if we could sell it as merchandise for his show that he did in 2017 for the 40-year anniversary of Monty Python's Holy Grail.
Okay.
and I agreed to do that. And we did a test run of 100 prints, and they started off the tour, and I joined them. I was going to go just for a few days. We started off in West Palm in Florida, and the first night, 24 of these 100 prints sold, and they had still all these cities to go around the United States. So, it became the best-selling merchandise he'd ever had.
What a surreal experience that is for you.
Yeah, I was 22 years old at that point, and I was quite literally beside myself. Yeah.
There you go, and you've got that artistic flair that people I wasn't aware of. It's so.
Yeah.
There's so many different layers.
It's a great, that's also a great connector and a great way to release trauma and get out of your head in a way that's like occupational too. Like my friend Moz, who I was running with this morning, he's a Kurdish refugee from Iran, and he paints too. And he was an Archibald finalist last year. Yeah.
Okay. Oh,
yeah.
Well,
and he's a runner too. I'm starting to
impressive.
teaching him to run.
Well, I see with running, you call it like moving meditation, and I do understand that. You can just switch off and just focus, and it's just one step after the other. Your running's pretty incredible. Like, I think the furthest, or maybe not the furthest, but there was one you ran 72 k's straight.
Yeah, 72 k's straight. So my cousin Eloise and I ran for 7 hours and 17 minutes in 2020.
That was raising money, Black Lives Matter, flowing on from that?
Yeah, so in 2020 there was obviously the tragic death of George Floyd, and what became a symbol of that was the 8:46. So the original recording of the time that he was asphyxiated was the 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And while I was in America, I used to run with some friends of mine who had been training for Boston. And after that tragic event, they decided to raise money by running for 8 hours and 46 minutes as a way of giving unspoken solidarity to a cause. Because often I think, there are all different ways to get out there and do something. Sometimes it's not our issue to speak about, but we can still help in different ways.
Yep.
And also I think sometimes it's really hard, when we think about, how can we make change? Like I don't have, the thought can sometimes be I don't have the particular skill in this area, or I have skills, but how do I apply them to change making? And so that's what they did, and they raised some money that way. And I thought, well, how could we do that here, but also put a more local focus on it, because we obviously have our own dark history in Australia.
Deaths in custody.
Yeah, deaths in custody, and that's what we looked at. So at that time, so this was the middle of 2020.
Yep.
At that time, there's been a significant number since then, especially during COVID. The numbers escalated, but there were 473, I believe.
Reported deaths in custody.
Reported, that's right. And so, 427, I should say.
Yes.
That was it. Sorry. And so that broke down into 7 hours and 17 minutes.
And that's what inspired you to run that far.
Yeah, so we did.
Well, good on you. I went to the Black Lives Matters march here in Sydney. And I've got to say, it was one of the most powerful things I've seen when collectively a group, and it was during the COVID, and there was whether the police were going to allow the march, and there was a lot of pressure. I had one of the politician, David Shoebridge, a Greens MP, on, and he was trying to facilitate it as a peaceful march, and the police weren't sure whether there was going to be approval. But I still get chills up my spine when we got to near Central Railway Station, and the march was allowed to go ahead, and everyone just took a knee and down on one knee, and it was such a moving, powerful,
all up my legs and arms there.
Yeah, and that's how I felt too, and just being part of that group, and it was just making a statement. It was making a statement in a peaceful way, but such a powerful way of making a statement. When we first spoke to each other, I had Andrew Carpenter on
Yep.
the podcast here, who I met Andrew through doing work on a podcast called Predatory with
Yep.
Madeline West, and talking about pedophiles. And it's such it's a subject. And when Madeline, I knew Madeline West, she approached me, and she'd been a victim of child sexual abuse. Said, what could we do? And we talked about it and said, well, we've got to get it out there, haven't we? We've got to get people talking about it. And that's how we met Andrew Carpenter. What I learn every day. I don't know if that's because I'm stupid or I've got a closed
You're not
mind.
stupid.
But every day I learn something. But working on that podcast, so many things that just speaking to Madeline and speaking to others that really played out. But a consistency was that people just don't like talking about the subject, and therefore it gets swept under the carpet. If it's happened in the family, there's always an issue. Well, if we go to the police and blow this up, it's going to destroy the family. But I don't think there's any other option. Like, there is no offence, and I think Andrew makes this point very clear. You can't consent to child sexual abuse.
No, you can never consent, and this is why I say child sexual abuse is in a class all of its own. A child can't consent for myriad reasons. It's not just a legal construct, which often actually child sex offenders, they try to argue. They've got a very long script where they try to argue as if this is a debate, like other things, where there is this like false balance between an adult and a child. But a child can't consent because they are not just physically, but socially and, more importantly, neurologically still developing.
Yep.
So that the power imbalance between an adult who is a self-governing, independent individual and a child who is a dependent, who is reliant upon their caregivers to provide their needs and to model behaviour, that power imbalance is heavily weighted multifactorially in favour of the adult.
Yeah.
And then you add other things like access to finances, access to resources. They'll have a car, they might have a home, all these other things that a child just doesn't have. Besides the ability to understand their everyday experiences, let alone these subtleties of something like psychological grooming and then the sexual offending, which often happens over a long period of time. So it's like that frog in boiling water analogy, that the temperature is turned up so slowly that you begins to
Feel
be
the
your
norm.
normal.
Yes.
Yeah. It's something that we need to draw harder lines in the sand, both in our social conscience, but also in the law.
Well, I think the law, and this is my, I won't say a layman's point of view because I work within the law for a long time, but if someone knows, if I know you've committed a murder and I don't come forward.
Not me personally, I didn't commit a murder, Gary.
We're talking that'd be get ratings up. Great. Go on, Grace. Who? Tell us.
You caught me, Gary. That's
knew
why I'm on the podcast.
I knew
Gary
I could break
caught
you down.
me.
It was a sting and we've got you. Okay, besides the murder that you've committed, if you did commit a murder and I knew about it and I didn't tell the police, I've committed an offence. I've concealed a serious offence. I don't know why we don't go after people that know that a child has been sexually assaulted and haven't come forward. We've got to start charging those people. I think that will make a difference.
But that's because this is the point, right? Child sex offenders require an ecosystem of abuse in which to offend.
Yeah.
It's an entire system. And I think that's where part of the education piece really needs to be amplified, and we need to do a lot more work in that preventative space and really understanding that this crime is not a crime of impulse, and it's not even a crime of opportunity where somebody just strikes in that moment.
No.
To procure and groom an already isolated child, a child who's struggling, who comes from a disadvantaged background for whatever reason, it's a really difficult task that requires taking a number of steps, and it requires subverting not just legal protocols, but it requires manipulating a lot of adults.
Yep.
And it takes time to do that. So you've got to have the knowledge, you've got to have the preparation, you've got to have the will, Got to have the criminal intent to harm a child and then to actually access them, to plot that out and then to execute it and then to engage in the secrecy. That is a lot of steps. And there's a lot of opportunities to hold up a mirror and go, fuck, maybe I should not do this.
Yeah. Yeah, there is, the way you've described it there's so many steps that they could take a step back or stop it.
And, even outside of that, the spectrum of bad behaviour is pretty large. And I think every single individual you will make mistakes. And even, we will sometimes tell white lies.
Yep.
That's part of recognising that the self is different to the external world.
Yep.
Children do it all the time. That's what we do. But that spectrum of bad behaviour is very different to that kind of calculated, cunning manipulation. And I think there's also, first of all, there's a lack of understanding of that, and then there's part of it is a lack of a willingness to accept that somebody would be so evil as to do that.
That's an interesting point that you make, because I think sometimes people can't even comprehend it. So when it's the evidence is presented to people, they go, "Oh, he wouldn't do that. He wouldn't do that." You talked about not being able to give character references for child sex offenders. I like that idea.
Yeah,
I
it's
like
a
that
great
idea because they manipulate. So they're going to present to, let's say, a former Prime Minister as a decent person who then gives a reference to someone. Oh, yes, that was fine, upstanding citizen. But that's because they're hiding the character of what they're doing.
They're part of their own cover-up.
Yeah.
The cover-up is part of the crime. And in my view, so this is what I said in support of Harry, James and Jared Grice, who are running this incredible campaign that they created. In my view, a character reference, a good character reference, if I was prosecuting, right, any character reference that a child sex offender provided to me, I would go, this is further evidence of grooming. Thank you very much.
That's a good way of looking at it.
Thank you. If you are capable of abusing a child, of course you're going to do absolutely anything else to create that web, that's part of that grooming and offending synthesis, which, again, includes manipulating adults and sometimes people are actually not even aware that they are a pawn. The better that an offender is, the more studied that an offender is, the more concealed their offending will be.
That's their safety blanket quite
is.
often, because when the accusation's made, people come in and defend. No, that's not him. It's not the person I know, and it's sort of shut down.
It's classic.
Time and time again.
Straight out of the playbook. I mean, it's interesting though, because there's also the hiding in plain sight.
Yep.
And so, that in a way, often what offenders will do is they will create an atmosphere of desensitization, so that is so normal that people don't know what to take seriously. So it's almost like, oh, that's not serious. That's just their shtick, which is part of what the offender who abused me did. He was a soldier before he was a teacher, and he would often say obscene things to everybody. The way that this man abused me was really sadistic. It was at times very banal. It wasn't this glamorous time. I mean, to leave a child in an office for an unknown amount of time and then come back at 9 o'clock at night when they've been sitting there all day. I mean, I haven't seen that in a movie.
No,
it's not that kind of thing. And I was, of course, groomed to think that this person was somebody that was in a quote-unquote relationship with, and that's how he's painted it when he's done interviews, and he has this narrative that he spins. But it wasn't that. It was scary to me. He would make sexually charged comments, but he would also say things that were just disturbing generally. My friend Megan recently was reflecting on how when she had her septum pierced, so she had a nose ring here. And he said to her, "Oh, you're like one of the tribal women I killed." You know, and just things that to say to a child are beyond inappropriate. when you think about it.
But then it's also a form of defence for him. Oh, that's just him. You know,
Yeah.
He's always been that way. He's always been a bit handy with kids. He likes playing with kids, or the way he talks, he's a bit risque. And then you look back when it all comes out in the wash, what he's actually done, and you think, Jesus, it was staring us in the face.
Yeah.
It's time and time again. The other thing about the offenders that really, I think this is where it's separated from all other crimes. And I've investigated every type of crime you can. But what it separates is the manipulation after the offence.
Oh, yeah.
The psychological manipulation, the control and all that. The offence basically continues on.
Oh, yeah. And that's often not known about, or it's not considered in its entirety, because we will hear about these things sort of in piecemeal blocks.
Yeah.
But really, it goes on for years. It goes on for years because these offenders don't relent. They will resort to any means possible in many cases to continue to access as much of the mind of their victims and their victims' network to maintain that control over them, especially if the victim survivor, tries to defend themselves or speak up and expose the offender for who they are.
Yep.
But these offenders are cognitive misers. They really are very calculating, and they will often know the black letter of the law. Just like they exploit people, they exploit systems. They know how to weaponize. They know how to create weapons out of anything, not just to sexualize, but to just to
keep the control.
To keep the control.
I saw it with a situation that it was outside of policing, but someone approached me and about the person's actions, and I gave them certain advice, arranged for them to go report it to the police, and then this person, the suspect, when they became aware of it, he then went at the child victim's parents and said, "I'm going to sue you." And this was a fine, upstanding person with plenty of money, and they turned against me. Like, as in, I've said, "Don't worry about it. You tell him to contact me, and we'll see what happens." They never spoke to me again. They got so terrified by the fact that this person had threatened to sue them, even though, to my way of thinking, it was fairly obvious that you could prove this case. It was there for a conviction, waiting for a conviction. They decided not to proceed with it because of the threat that he made to sue them. That type of stuff.
It's really common.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Andrew Carpenter before, who back in 2020 created this campaign called Super for Survivors.
I love it.
Yeah, which is, and again, it really highlights what you were talking about before, is that often after the fact, these child sex offenders will, they'll avoid accountability as well, but they will exploit systems to their advantage. And Andrew's campaign is aimed at closing two key loopholes. One is in superannuation legislation, and the other is in the Bankruptcy Act. Because often child sex offenders will, if they're facing civil litigation wherein they've been asked to pay compensation to their victim or victims, what they will do is they will divest their assets into their superannuation account and make themselves look cash poor on paper, then cry bankruptcy.
Yeah.
We're trying to... We've jumped on board to support Andrew. We joined him in last year, 2022. So did Madeline West, who you've mentioned before. So did the Carly Ryan Foundation. So Sonia Ryan is the mother of Carly Ryan, who was tragically murdered by a pedophile who groomed her online. Yeah. And then also Adam from Fighters Against Child Abuse Australia. So, what we're trying to do is to close those loopholes to stop them from doing it.
I spoke to Adam Andrew, about it, and it seems to me to make a lot of sense, given the fact that most situations that the child sexual abuse doesn't get reported for 23.9 years
Yeah,
later.
23.9 years, and the conviction rate is 0.3%. So,
Yeah.
Adam Andrew probably mentioned that, but yeah, it's 0.3%. And we think of adult on adult sexual offending, that conviction rate's pretty low. It's about 1.5 or 1.7%. It's
It all
0.3%.
makes a lot of sense, and I think we want to make this country the hardest country for child sex offenders. Like, as in, there's no winning here. And
at the moment, it's the easiest because it is the most underpunished crime, child sexual offending.
Well,
in Australia,
I think the sentencing, we need to come to terms with. Sentence should reflect the impact it's had on the crime, the impact the crime has had. And I don't
it's a life sentence.
100%. I don't think there's an appreciation. And one of the things, and I said I learned that I always assumed that with prisons that they don't like child sex offenders because of the nature of the crime. Speaking to Russell Manser and a couple of other people that have been victims of institutionalised child sexual abuse, half the people in there have been victims. That's why they don't like the offenders. And that I've been a cop, around the prison system for a long time, and everything that was going on. I didn't realise it, but that sort of brought it home too. So I've got all these people that are interested in true crime and fascinated by crime, or how do we make a difference in crime. We could perhaps make the biggest difference in crime if we just prevented child sexual abuse. Yeah,
and you would also reduce the number of people in therapy.
Yeah.
Well, there's a whole industries are filled up with people who have been sexually abused in childhood.
The impact of it all. Let's just change subjects for a bit. Switch gears for a little bit. Okay. 2021, Australian of the Year.
Oof.
Yeah, scary.
Not really switching gears there, are we?
No, but we'll talk about talk about that position and the impact it had on you. And again, I've taken some things from your book, but it was almost like I'd call it a double-edged sword for you.
In many ways.
That being nominated and winning that. And I'll just read out the quote from your book. I could not be prouder, more honoured or more grateful to be the first public survivor of child sexual abuse to have been named an Australian of the Year. It was a beautiful moment in history that night, one that was shared with so many, a necessary moment at that, which above all was symbolic, empowering and hopefully of what was to come. And that's the positive side. And then you also make the comment, it was simultaneously one of the loneliest moments of my life because the one person who couldn't be there to share it with me was me when I was a young child. She was hidden from everyone's view. That's pretty heavy stuff there. Do you want to just explain or expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this a lot recently. That particular night has sort of come up in my memory a lot. I had to be pretty guarded. I didn't know that I was going to win. All of us had to be prepared. All of us nominees, and we were a pretty strong category that year. I thought that I was not anywhere near that standard of nominee. I really didn't think that I had a chance against people like Shane Fitzsimmons and, Donna Stolzenberg, who's done incredible work for homeless people in Victoria, and, Tanya Hosh and everyone, really, Dinesh and everyone. And so, I had a speech prepared, but afterwards I was up in the hotel room and Max was asleep, and all of the category winners, so there's Local Hero, there's Senior Australian of the Year, there's Young Australian of the Year, and then there's Australian of the Year. And all of us had to be in the lobby of the Crown Plaza where the event nominees were all put up. We had to be in the lobby at 4 a.m. the next morning for just back-to-back interviews that went until midday. And I didn't have a lot of experience at that point with media. Certainly not with national media. I'd done a few pieces of media, but very spaced out, and not me being spaced out.
We'll talk about that later.
Are you going to talk about the bong photo, Gary?
No, I'm not even.
There's the humour.
I'm not even referring to the bong photo. I'm referring to content in the book. But anyway, let's go on. Just on that, first of all, like, that is such, every word you say from that point in time is going to be seized upon, looked at. It just takes you to a new stratosphere.
And when they paint me as being angry or anything like that, and the stuff that you don't see behind the screen is when they ambush people like me. And I've talked to so many other child sexual abuse survivors or survivors of any kind of trauma. And what they do often is they tell you they're going to talk about something. And especially when you are getting prepared to talk about your trauma, you need to get yourself prepared. And then what they'll do is they will change the goalposts right live on national television. And that's why you get mad, because it's like, I'm coming here to help you, and then you want to make me look like a fool. That's why you get mad.
I do understand that, and I've now been in the media for 3 or 4 years, and I understand that the manipulation that comes.
And that's the same predation. It's the same abuse. And I said that when I was at the press club the first time. I've
got a note here, Grace, like at the National Press Club speech on 3rd of March 2021, you talk about how the media re-traumatises survivors by not listening closely to the boundaries they set.
Yeah, and it's not hard either. It's like what people, again, especially children who've never had the opportunity to set their own boundaries, often they don't know what they are, boundaries, because they've had such porous boundaries. They've been so used to people coming along and just being able to push them around and dictate the terms, and you know, often people have, like I've said, so much more darkness that they're not sharing with the public. What's next? It's like you said, and this is, he abused me in 2010. It's 2023, and this is very common. This is not anomalous, you know. These offenders, they do this. They just...
Well, to commit the crime in the first place, they've got to have this hide, this thick skin, this no empathy whatsoever.
Exactly. Like where people go wrong as well, I think, sometimes, not always, but there's a tendency to look at everything through the lens of logic and reason, and also think that every individual thinks in the same way that we do, with logic and reason, and think that their up is up and their down is down, and their feeling, you know, of happiness is happiness. What they want is what we want. No.
Yeah.
You just got to, it's a whole different map that they're using. And yeah, so it's in many ways it's wonderful. And it's what I think of are all the great things, how the platform has become shared with all of these survivors who, you know, we've talked about on the podcast, who are coming forward, and all of these other experts, you know, whether it's the legal experts like Andrew Carpenter, or, you know, Michael Bradley from Mark Lawyers, who did the legal work for the hashtag Let Her Speak campaign back in, 2018, 2019, and then who did the legal work for Harry James and Jared Grice, who is the lawyer who does the legal work for the foundation, you know, and every month we provide legal funding for the legal work of child sexual abuse survivors, you know, and then other experts in the field, Mike Salter, who's the chair of the foundation, but who's also a doctor of criminology, and he's just an expert, and he does some work with the ACE and stuff like that. And all those guys at the ACE, you know, you know those guys. They're fantastic. Like, all of this stuff that's happening where people are getting together and they are platforming this more. I think that's great.
It is great, but I also want to say that, like, full credit to you, because you're taking on a big responsibility. You've got the platform.
It is shared, though. It's a shared resposibility. That's how I think of it.
Okay,
yeah,
and that certainly helps when you know that there's other people in there pushing for you. But, you were thrust. How old were you when you got Australian of the Year? What, 26?
I just had my 26th birthday a month before,
so it's pretty young to take all that
Definitely.
responsibility.
Oh, yeah.
And then the media, will build you up. They'll build you down. I know you're probably sick of the conversation about you meeting with Scott Morrison and the side-eye view of Scott Morrison. But, again, I'm looking at it. I put my hand up. That was what I saw. I wasn't dealing in too deep, but you must be sick of talking about that. You can tell me. Shut the...
Well, I mean, it's one of those things where there were endless projections onto my face, and I appreciate that every individual will have their own view, and that's good. That's what makes a healthy democracy, I suppose. And I appreciate that. And interestingly, one of the people who had a very negative reaction at the outset was my mother, and my mother has been through a lot of trauma in her own life.
Yep.
And some of that is mentioned in the book.
Yep.
And she certainly does. She comes from a generation where there was a lot more, suppression of things. I think just generally, and it's not just for women. I think there was a lot of that. There was a lot of the response that I got was, it was about women realizing that they didn't have to smile anymore. And for me, that's not actually what I thought.
Yeah.
For me, it was about not playing the game, and especially in the context of the experiences that I had gone through and what I had witnessed.
Yeah.
And sort of what we spoke about before was that sometimes it's these really little things that you don't even realize, is that not giving permission and not bowing down to people, because I do believe there is basic respect that everybody deserves.
Yes.
No matter who you are, no matter what your background is, no matter if you're a 5-year-old kid or the king.
Yeah.
Although I don't know about that guy, but anyway, no matter who you are, no matter, there is basic respect that everybody deserves to give and receive as a human being. Beyond that, however, if people demand inflated respect and they weaponize that respect as a tool of excess control to dominate, and they seek to dominate and have and use it to manipulate as well, and really create an environment where abuse can foster or corruption can foster, that is not respect. That is something entirely different. And I don't believe in that. That's what I was trying to communicate.
Okay. Well, you communicated very well. I thought it was one of the best stare downs I've seen. I've got to say. Can you give it to me now? See? Okay, you've made your point.
Maybe I could be your sidekick.
Yeah,
you could. Looks could kill.
Yeah.
Maybe I reckon we could take out
whole
regimes, Gary.
I like the side look. I sort of more the eye roll, just the eyebrows. But
I've got quite an elastic face. You can tell I've never had any Botox because I've got.
You made a point that day, so good on you. And I
hope it also for me too is teaching kids that keeping secrets is not good, because that's that part of that operant, what we call like operant conditioning, which is a foundation of the social engineering that's grooming.
Yep.
Where we teach kids like, oh, if you do this, then I'll give you a reward. Or if you don't do this, I'll punish you. And the secret keeping as well, that becomes a part of that mechanism. No, you don't have to participate in that. If you don't feel comfortable, if you've got a gut instinct that says, I don't want to give this person a hug that asks me for a hug, or if I don't want to sit on this person's knee,
that in itself is strong messaging, isn't it? Because that's where I think the mistakes were made a long time ago. Well, they're an adult, you comply to the adult. We've got to give the kids the power to, no, you don't have to if it makes you feel uncomfortable.
And that's not, there's a big difference between just questioning, like I said, blind compliance.
Yep.
And total anarchy.
Yeah, they've got to be boundaries.
So a few steps.
Yeah.
So questioning blind compliance and that sheep mentality and total anarchy. I think it's important to be able to question healthily without it breaking into, what we now term, and I don't know if I like this term, but it gets a buzzword, but this sort of like cancel culture where it's nobody's really listening to each other.
Yeah.
But just healthily going, is this okay?
Yeah, I get where you're coming from. I'm referring to the book again because there were so many things that I pulled out of it. And one thing, and I think I've titled this sort of self-reflection, but it's you talking about yourself. And I'll just read it out and get you to comment on that. I've made mistakes and some thoughtless choices along the way, no doubt. At a time, I've been selfish and rigid in my outspoken opinions. I've been foolhardy and determined to the point of impatience. I've fallen, I've broken, and I've had to learn to pull myself back up over and over and over again. That's part of the play that tests your limits and builds your character. You're only young, but you're talking stuff that's very reflective on life. But do you want to just expand on that?
For sure. Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm definitely my own harshest critic, and I always am trying to improve in many ways, whether it's in my work or just in my personal life. But yeah, I mean, I've learned the hard way in many areas, especially, yeah. I mean, before I had a public profile, and when I was living overseas, I think and this is very common for people who were abused in childhood. When you don't have a good frame of reference, some of your responses to what you experience can be maladaptive, I used sort of a lot of like distractive techniques, whether that was like running to excess.
Yeah.
And I fell back into that when I was the Australian of the Year. I was actually quite sick leading up to that. I stopped menstruating in early 2019 and didn't start again until the day before I gave that press club speech in March
and
of 2021.
Was that through eating disorder or training?
Yeah,
or?
both. Yeah. So amenorrhea through restrictive eating and excessive running, as a manifestation of something that I've dealt with since I was a young child. Since I was 12, 13, 14, and I was hospitalised when I was 14. But that sort of mentality can make one very, like I sort of said, like it's not a selfishness out of it's a self-preservation, and there's behaviours that come out of that where you because you're starving, you have a lack of insight into how your behaviours often affect others, and then after you become well again, you can reflect on that and you can see, and I have friends as well who've been through it, and sometimes I'll run with them and they're at a different phase in their healing, and I have compassion for where they're at, and it's hard to be around because you can just see that they're not aware that they're in a bad place, and
haven't got the perspective to step back and look.
But really, I think I didn't know. Like it was a lot to take on because there's, For me, I really struggled. I mean, I didn't go to the media. It wasn't sort of ever my choice. And even for the Let Her Speak campaign, like we were approached, but it was my mother who was approached first, because there was an injustice around her experience with the University of Tasmania. That's why we were approached.
I want to talk about that, but I want to keep it in context because I think what happened, not just with the offence, but the actions after and the way it was dealt with. There's so much to unravel, and we'll do that in the second part. There's a
Yeah.
couple of other things I wanted to cover now, but I might leave it to the second part. But let's just finish off on Bikram yoga. That's
Yeah.
another go-to place for you. Now, I know Bikram yoga, hot yoga, you could probably call it. It can play with your mind
Yeah.
if you go in there with the wrong attitude. When I first started doing it, I learnt that you had to go in there with the right attitude, because if you try and fight it, it's the worst 90 minutes of your life. What
And
did
you go in there without drinking water, Gary, or if you go in there having eaten too soon,
well,
you will see things you don't want to see, and they might be your breakfast.
I went in after having a boxing session and then thought, it's a yoga class, this will be fine. First session nearly killed me. Came back and I learnt you just got to let it go. Did that help you? Like I know with my life, different ups and downs in the work, it was sort of a thing that I had in my back pocket, that meditation,
Yeah.
that I could go there and really sort of balance myself out. Is that what you were looking for with your Bikram yoga?
Yeah, I mean, I think we just need to be upfront about this. Bikram himself did not help me because Bikram is a very...
He's a bit of a weird dude, isn't he?
Well, weird is not the right term.
I heard stuff about that.
Yeah,
but
very, very problematic person, Bikram. But I got into Bikram not knowing who Bikram was.
Yeah.
I was only 14.
Yeah.
And I started doing Bikram yoga after I had come out of hospital. I'd spent 6 weeks in hospital in 2009. As I mentioned, for anorexia treatment. And as a part of the recovery program in outpatient therapy, I was restricted in what I could do for exercise. Prior to going into hospital, I'd always been a really active kid. I ran a lot in childhood. I also played soccer. I had done water polo. I had done club swimming. I really loved the outdoors, and I was always really active. I'm really active now. And, I surf, all those sorts of things. And I found myself not being allowed to do any high-intensity exercise. My meals were all monitored. My meals were monitored at school. But one of my best friends, Gillian, who's still one of my best friends today, who I met at high school, her mother at the time, who's sadly no longer with us, Sally, she was a beautiful, beautiful woman. She was practicing Bikram yoga. And she was who introduced me to yoga. And the three of us, Gillian, Sally, and I went along to Bikram yoga. And I liked it because, as you've identified, it's yoga, but it has all these other layers of intensity and discipline, and you can get a workout from it while doing a meditation and something that is a little bit more still.
Yeah, you've got to just let yourself go in it. But you ended up getting qualified as an instructor, and so you must have got into it in a big way.
Yeah, it wasn't Bikram. I didn't get trained in Bikram yoga. I was trained in like both Hatha yoga and then a Vinyasa style yoga through Core Power. That's a franchise in the United States. So after I moved to Santa Barbara in the middle of 2013, when I was 18. There was a studio just down the road from the share house that I lived in, and I would get up and walk there, and did a training course there, and then I did another one in 2018, I think it was. The beginning of 2018. So trained in a couple of styles.
Okay, and all of which I think is a healthy way of dealing with the trauma that you've gone through, and it gives you something to fall back on when you need it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's wrap up part one, and when we get back, and I said at the start there's a lot to Grace Tame that people don't know about, and when we get back, we're going to talk about if it's okay with you, talk about the circumstances of the systematic sexual abuse when you're younger. I just want to ask you a question before we take a break. And I always like to use the right terminology. Do you prefer, and it's a personal thing, a victim of sexual abuse or a survivor of sexual abuse? Is that something that's that we need to educate the public on, or is it a personal?
Yeah, so I call myself a survivor of child sexual abuse. Specific about I try to be as specific about every single word I use.
Yes.
So victim takes away the agency. Right, so survivor, I've overcome, and then child sexual abuse. So Child sexual abuse is, like I said before, it's a crime all of its own.
Sits on its own.
Sits on its own. So I've experienced sexual abuse as an adult above the age of 18.
Yep.
And there's trauma that comes from that as well. And there's those different experiences, but there's something very distinct about the experience of child sexual abuse, which is often a prolonged experience.
Yeah.
So the Australian childhood maltreatment study that came out this year revealed that children who've been sexually abused, 78% of them have experienced it more than once, and 42% of them have experienced it at least 6 times. So it's often protracted. It's often, and that speaks to this grooming element that's often necessary, like I said before, to actually procure the child.
It's not a random
No,
act.
it's not
just
random.
an opportunity that's, I agree with you. The pedophiles that I've come up against in my policing career, they were so manipulative. They were proactive. They went looking for it. Every moment of their waking day was working out how to get access to children. They're the ones that I've come across. So.
Yeah, and it's not to take away from the experience of crime that's perpetrated by adults. Obviously, there are very manipulative adults who often prey on other adults, and there's that, and there's grooming that can occur, between adults, and there's the coercive control.
Well,
and
I
the
want to
domestic
talk to you
violence
about
and
the
that sort of
coercive
thing.
control, and we'll do that in part 2 because I think that's legislation that needs to come in sooner rather than later, and we need to use it to the fullest extent.
Yeah, and understand how to do it so that it doesn't fall back on the victim survivors, because that's a tricky area, because often we see perpetrators who are able to commit this DAVO, as we call it, the deny, attack, and then reverse victim and offender, you know, where cops will get called to the scene, and it's because finally, at long last, a victim survivor has been pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed through stealthy erosion of boundaries or stealthy erosion of self-esteem over a really long period of time, and then they act out in self-defense, and then they get criminalised for one tiny little thing, things like that.
And that's we'll talk about that. But that's the police need it in black and white. And there's a physical act. Okay, we can act on that. But what's left or what's lost is all that manipulation, that bullying, that harassment, that financial control, the control of friends,
precipitating behaviour. Yeah. So that's and the law. You know, we often call it a blunt instrument, which how in its sort of most primitive form often fails in its definitional or provisional vagaries to sort of capture those things. So we need to be able to reform it so that it has scope to recognise all that.
I've seen in Queensland, I've seen a draft of the legislation, and I think it's workable. I think it's something that can be used. But we'll take a break now, and we'll be back for part 2 shortly.
Sweet.
If you promise to come back.
I'm not going anywhere.
Good.
I'd have to run, and I'm not in my running shoes.
I've heard the times you do for a half marathon. You got away from me.
1:23. What's your fastest half, Gary?
What would it be? I reckon 1:45. I've only run a marathon once.
What was your marathon time?
It was 4 hours and 20 minutes. I didn't train for it.
Okay, that's fair enough.
But Can
you do a sub 3?
I reckon in my heyday I could have. I'm talking shit now. No, sub 3. I don't think I'd even.
That was my only goal, and my mum was waiting at the finish line. She's there, and it was ticked over 2 hours and 59, and then I came around the corner at 2 hours 59 30 seconds.
That is a goal that you should be very proud of.
I want to beat it. I want to do like a 2:45.
You've got to put in so much work for it to get there. That's what. I naively, when I ran the marathon, I thought I can run 10Ks. Okay, well, I'll just run another 10. That's 20. I was going fine. I got to the halfway mark, and my body just shut down.
I know. You said like that's literally what I wrote in that. And anyone who's like, some people will lie straight through their teeth, and I don't know if they're just telling themselves a lie. And they're like, oh, I ran a marathon. It was a really good. I'm like, you're fucking lying. You run it. I got halfway, and the voice inside my head, my own voice, went, "You've got to do this again."
fell apart at the seams once I crossed that halfway mark. I was smiling before then, and then I just gone, fuck.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. I just went, you've got to do that. Like you're basically sprinting when you're trying to do a fast pace.
Yeah.
You know, and I had no concept of doing a marathon at that pace. I'd just done a half at that pace.
Yeah.
And I shaved 5 minutes off my half time. I'd done a 90-minute half. Then I ran the first half of that marathon in 1:25, and my body has just gone, you've got to fucking do that again.
But you're aiming for the 3 hours. I always look at the people running 3 hour time, the timekeeper sort of thing. It's kicking along in a pace.
Yeah, you're quick. Little, and I'm a little cadence machine, so my feet are like.
You can't pick it. I've been run past people that you think you can't run, and they just, for whatever reason, that just glides along. But good on you if you're aiming for that. That's cool. All right, we'll be back soon.